Captain Richard Calloway had once been a name spoken with respect. A retired Navy officer, he had spent decades serving his country. But now, years later, he lived alone in a sprawling, isolated estate, far removed from the bustling world he once knew. His reputation had faded, his presence reduced to nothing more than whispers in the small town where he resided. The loneliness had been swallowing him for years, and when the opportunity to adopt came, it seemed like a lifeline. He wanted to help, to give 2 orphan sisters a chance at a better life. Mia and Zara, twins from Africa, were chosen to be his new family. Richard's motivations, at first glance, seemed kind-hearted. He spoke of wanting to provide a home for children who had none. Yet, beneath his well-kept facade, something darker lurked. His military background and rigid demeanor hinted at a man who thrived on control. The way he walked through his house with purpose, the way he eyed the twins, there was a tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. The twins were brought to his estate, a grand home perched on a hill, its towering gates and sprawling grounds an eerie reflection of the isolation that would soon consume them. The estate was far from help, with no neighbors in sight and no one to hold Richard accountable. The girls were introduced to their new world, a world that would, unknowingly to them, soon suffocate them. Mia and Zara had been through much together. Growing up in a war-torn region, they had learned to rely on one another for survival. They held a bond forged through adversity, their love and care for each other unwavering. Zara was the more outgoing twin, strong and protective, always ready to shield Mia from harm. She was the louder one, the one who made decisions, while Mia was quiet and reserved. She was always content to let her sister take the lead, preferring to stay in the background, observing the world through a soft, distant gaze. Despite their different personalities, Mia and Zara shared everything. Stories from their childhood, dreams of a life beyond their struggles, and hopes for a future free from fear. The bond they shared was unbreakable, or so they thought. Zara always promised to protect Mia, to never let anything or anyone hurt her. But when they arrived at Richard's estate, the familiar comfort of their closeness began to falter. Zara began to notice the strange rules Richard imposed upon them, the way he spoke to Mia differently, and the isolation that surrounded them in the house. Mia, once so lively, began to change. Her smiles grew rare, her laughter almost non-existent. She seemed to retreat further into herself, while Zara continued to fight for her sister's well-being. As days turned into weeks, Richard's attention began to shift. At first, it was subtle, an extra hour of attention to Mia, a special request for her to accompany him on errands while Zara was left behind. He justified his behavior by saying he wanted to help Mia adjust to her new life, but it soon became clear that there was something more to it. He spent more time with Mia than Zara, coaxing her into his study for discussions that never seemed to involve her twin. He praised her for her calm nature and her obedience. It made Zara uncomfortable, but she didn't fully understand why at first. Richard became more insistent on Mia's compliance, often isolating her from Zara under the guise of helping her grow. The twins started noticing strange rules, doors locked at odd hours, and Richard's erratic temper when they questioned them. Zara couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, but Mia refused to share her feelings. She seemed to pull away from Zara even further, leaving her to face Richard's growing hostility alone. One day, Zara overheard Richard speaking to Mia in a manner that sent a chill through her spine. It was too casual, too personal. She heard him tell Mia that she didn't need her sister to protect her anymore, that she could learn to be strong on her own. The words, though not directly threatening, sent a shiver through Zara's body. The first signs of abuse were subtle, as Richard knew how to keep his actions hidden behind a mask of kindness. At first, it was small gestures, unnecessary touches, a lingering hand on Mia's shoulder. He would comment on how delicate and beautiful she was, how much potential she had to become a great woman. These comments made Mia uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to escape them. It wasn't long before his care turned more invasive, more controlling. He began touching her inappropriately, under the guise of affection. The small, uncomfortable touches turned into forceful grabs, his hands lingering too long in places they should never have been. Mia's discomfort deepened as Richard's obsession grew. He told her that he was just teaching her about life and how to be strong, how to grow into a woman. But all Mia felt was fear. She became quieter, her once bright eyes now clouded with a growing sense of dread. She stopped looking Richard in the eye, avoided him when possible, and distanced herself from Zara. Her once close bond with her twin began to weaken, her silence growing heavier. Zara noticed a change in Mia. She noticed how Mia became distant, withdrawn, and avoided her gaze. She would often catch Mia staring at the floor, her eyes avoiding her own. Zara tried to reach out, but Mia would either pull away or give her vague answers. The weight of Mia's sadness hung over them both, but Zara couldn't figure out what was happening. She knew something was wrong, but Mia wasn't telling her. One evening, when Mia refused to eat dinner and locked herself in her room, Zara finally confronted her. She demanded to know what was going on, but Mia only shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm fine, Zara. Please don't worry about me." But Zara knew better. The look in Mia's eyes spoke volumes, and deep down, she knew the truth: Richard was hurting her sister. If you're liking this story so far, please give a like to this video and subscribe to our channel now. Moving forward, the days turned into weeks, and the situation only worsened. Mia's once vibrant spirit continued to wither under Richard's oppressive control. She spent her days in silence, hiding her emotions behind a mask of compliance. She had become a ghost in her own life, drifting through each day without purpose, only focusing on surviving until the next. Her body had grown thinner, her cheeks more hollow, and her once bright eyes had lost their luster. She spent her nights locked away in her room, scribbling furiously in a small, worn-out journal. The pages were filled with her pain, pages that Richard would never see. She wrote about the fear that consumed her, the touch of Richard's hands that she couldn't escape, and the hopelessness that had taken root in her heart. Mia poured her soul into those pages, each word a cry for help that no one would ever hear. Zara, however, began to notice. She watched Mia closely, her heart breaking as she saw how much her sister had changed. The once tight bond between them seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Zara tried to reach out, tried to break through to Mia, but it felt like her sister was slipping through her fingers like water. The distance between them grew, and no matter how hard Zara tried, she couldn't break the barrier Mia had built around herself. Zara's frustration mounted, but she didn't know how to help her sister. She didn't know how to fix what was broken. The more she tried to get Mia to talk, the more Mia withdrew. It was as if she was already preparing herself for something darker that was coming, something that neither of them could stop. One morning, Zara woke to a stillness that felt wrong. The house, usually filled with the sounds of footsteps and Richard's gruff voice, was eerily quiet. She knocked on Mia's door, expecting to hear a soft response or a sign of life. But there was nothing. No answer. Zara's heart began to race as she pushed the door open. Inside, Mia was lying on the floor, lifeless. Zara's breath caught in her throat, and a sharp pain seared through her chest as she rushed to her sister's side. She shook Mia, calling her name, but it was too late. Her sister was gone. Grief flooded Zara's mind, drowning her in a wave of confusion and despair. She couldn't understand what had happened. Why? Why would Mia do this? The pain of seeing her sister, so fragile and broken, was unbearable. Tears streamed down Zara's face as she cradled Mia's body, her sobs echoing through the empty room. Amidst the chaos of her emotions, Zara noticed something on Mia's bedside table, a small folded note. With trembling hands, Zara unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words written in Mia's shaky handwriting. The note was a confession. Mia had written about the abuse, about Richard's cruelty, about the fear that had overtaken her life. She wrote that she couldn't bear it anymore, that she felt trapped in a nightmare with no escape. The final words in the note were an apology for leaving Zara alone, an apology for not being strong enough to survive. The note was more than just a goodbye, it was a window into Mia's suffering. Zara's heart shattered as she read the words, realizing that her sister had been silently dying inside while she, Zara, had been unaware of the depth of her pain. As Zara wiped her tears, she found Mia's journal hidden beneath the bed. With trembling hands, she opened it and began reading. The entries were filled with the same despair, the same haunting fear that had driven Mia to her end. Mia had been suffering in silence, and Zara had been blind to it. She had failed her sister. Zara knew she couldn't let Mia's death be in vain. She had to take action, but when she went to Mia's note and journal to show them to the police, they were gone. Panic set in as she searched the house, desperate to find the proof that would expose Richard for what he truly was. But there was no sign of the journal, no trace of the note. Richard had destroyed them. It was then that Richard confronted Zara, a twisted smile on his face. His eyes were cold, calculating, as if he knew everything she was thinking. "You thought you could outsmart me, didn't you?" he said, his voice smooth and mocking. "You really thought you could take those papers to the police and make them believe you?" Zara's stomach twisted with fear, but she didn't back down. "Where are they? What did you do with them?" Richard stepped closer, his presence suffocating. "It doesn't matter. You'll never be able to prove anything," he sneered. "Mia is gone, and no one will ever believe you. I've covered my tracks." He paused for a moment, his gaze darkening. "And if you even think about trying to expose me, I'll make sure you end up just like her. You think I don't have the means to get rid of you too?" Zara's blood ran cold. The threat was clear, and it was real. Richard had the power to destroy her, just as he had destroyed Mia. He had the power to silence her forever, and she knew it. But something inside her snapped. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let Mia's death be meaningless. She turned away, hiding her fear behind a mask of defiance. "I'll make sure everyone knows what you did," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You can't hide forever." In the days that followed, Zara felt the weight of Richard's threat bearing down on her. She couldn't trust anyone, no one in this house was safe, not even herself. She couldn't go to the police, Richard had made sure of that. The evidence was gone, and the only person who could have helped her, Mia, was gone too. Zara isolated herself, retreating into the shadows of the house, haunted by the image of her sister's lifeless body. Every room, every corner of the estate seemed to whisper Richard's cruelty, and she couldn't escape it. Fear and despair wrapped around her like chains, keeping her captive in the place that had once been her home. But despite the darkness that threatened to consume her, Zara couldn't shake the need for justice. Mia's death wasn't just a tragic accident, it was murder. And if she couldn't expose Richard with the evidence she had lost, she would find another way. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. 2 months had passed since Mia's death, and Zara was still trapped in the house with Richard, the shadows of her sister's death lingering in every room. But despite the suffocating fear and despair that threatened to consume her, something within Zara began to shift. She couldn't keep living in this nightmare. She couldn't keep letting Richard control her and destroy everything she loved. Zara spent those 2 months studying Richard. She observed his habits, his moods, his arrogance. She began to realize that beneath the facade of the powerful and untouchable Navy officer, Richard had weaknesses. His greatest flaw was his own pride and trust in his ability to manipulate everyone around him. Zara saw it, and for the first time since Mia's death, she felt a spark of hope. She knew she couldn't confront Richard directly, he was too dangerous. But she could use his own arrogance against him. If she could gain his trust, lower his guard, and make him believe that she was under his control, she might be able to gather the evidence she needed to expose him. It was risky, but it was the only chance she had. Zara began to play her part. She changed her behavior, becoming more submissive, more agreeable, even praising Richard for his wisdom and strength. Every word, every gesture was calculated to make him think she had finally accepted her place under his authority. She pretended to admire him, as if all the fear and pain she had felt had vanished. She allowed herself to pretend, to lie, to him and to herself. But that wasn't enough. Zara had to go further. She had to make Richard believe that she was loyal, that she saw him as a father figure, as someone she could trust. So, she began flirting with him. Subtle touches, lingering looks, compliments disguised as casual conversation, all designed to make him believe that she had come around, that she no longer feared him, and that perhaps she was beginning to enjoy his attention. Richard, intoxicated by the idea of his control over Zara, started letting his guard down. He started drinking more frequently, letting himself relax in her presence. His arrogance grew, and Zara saw it. She saw how easy it would be to manipulate him, to get him to confess. Zara's plan was coming together. She knew that Richard's study was the place where he felt most comfortable, especially when he was drinking. He liked to boast about his past and the power he wielded, often reliving old memories of his military career. It was the perfect setting for her to set the trap. Zara secretly bought a small hidden camera, a device small enough to remain undetected. She set it up in Richard's study, carefully positioning it where it could capture everything without being noticed. She knew that this was her best chance. If she could get Richard to open up in his drunken state, she would have the proof she needed. One evening, Zara prepared Richard's favorite drink, a whiskey he always seemed to savor. She offered him the glass with a soft smile, making sure to compliment him on how strong and admirable he was. The alcohol quickly took effect, loosening Richard's tongue and his inhibitions. Zara subtly steered the conversation toward Mia, pretending to sympathize with his frustrations. She mentioned how Mia had been difficult, rebellious, and ungrateful, playing into Richard's belief that he was justified in punishing her. Richard, his words slurred, began to open up, talking freely about his frustrations with Mia. He mentioned how she had resisted him, how she had become a problem, and how he had to take matters into his own hands. Zara let him talk, her heart pounding in her chest as she listened to the confession. He spoke of the abuse, of how Mia had tried to fight back, and how, in the end, she had been weak. He spoke of destroying the evidence, of covering his tracks to ensure that no one would ever find out what he had done. Zara's mind raced, but she kept her composure. Every word Richard spoke was another nail in his coffin. She couldn't let him stop, couldn't let him realize what he had done. She encouraged him, asking more questions, making him feel comfortable, making him believe that he was still in control. As Richard continued to speak, Zara's heart hammered in her chest. She knew she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The camera was still recording, capturing every word, every twisted confession. Richard was drunk, his words full of venom and arrogance, revealing not only the abuse but his complete lack of remorse. "I did what I had to do," Richard slurred. "Mia wasn't strong enough. She was a burden. And now she's gone, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. I'm untouchable." Zara held back her emotions, though every word he spoke made her sick to her stomach. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The confession she needed to bring him down. As the conversation came to an end, Zara felt a cold sense of triumph. She had done it. She had the proof. But she couldn't afford to relax, not yet. She had to be careful, to make sure Richard never suspected a thing. With the camera still hidden, Zara quietly slipped away, knowing that the next step was crucial. The hidden camera had captured every word Richard had said, every confession, every taunt, every chilling detail about his abuse of Mia and his actions in the wake of her death. Zara could hardly believe it herself. For months, she had been suffocating under the weight of fear and grief, uncertain if she would ever have the strength to stand up to Richard. But now, in her hand, she held the key to justice, undeniable proof of his crimes. Zara knew she had to act. Richard was a man who had manipulated and terrorized everyone around him for years, and he was dangerous. He wouldn't go down easily. But she had no other choice. She couldn't live in fear any longer. She couldn't let him get away with what he had done to Mia. The next morning, Zara sat in her room, staring at the small recording device that held Richard's confession. The weight of what she was about to do was overwhelming. She could feel her heart racing, her palms sweating as she thought about how she would approach the police. Would they believe her? Would they dismiss her as another victim of a powerful man? But as she thought of Mia, the sister she had lost, the life that had been stolen from her, Zara found her resolve. She had to do this. For Mia. For herself. She had to bring Richard to justice. With a deep breath, Zara left her room and made her way to the phone. She dialed the police station, her hand shaking as she spoke to the officer on the other end. She gave a brief, cryptic description of what had happened, hinting at the truth she had discovered, and asked for a meeting. The officer, intrigued but cautious, agreed to meet her at the station later that afternoon. The moment Zara walked into the police station, she felt like her entire world was on the verge of collapsing. She had spent so long hiding in fear, staying silent, that now, finally speaking the truth felt like standing on the edge of a precipice. But there was no turning back. She had come this far, and now she had to see it through. The officer led her to a small room where they could speak privately. Zara placed the recording on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "I have something that will prove what happened to Mia," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I have proof of the abuse Richard Calloway inflicted on her. I have a confession." She pressed play on the device, and the sound of Richard's voice filled the room. His drunken confession echoed through the speakers, each word making Zara's blood run cold as she heard him describe in horrific detail how he had tormented Mia, how he had destroyed the evidence, and how he had ultimately caused her death. The officer listened in silence, his face hardening with each passing second. When the recording ended, he didn't say anything at first. He just looked at Zara, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, he nodded. This is enough to start an investigation. We'll take it from here." Zara exhaled, the weight of the moment lifting just a little. She had done it. She had finally taken a stand, and the truth was out. But she knew that this was only the beginning. The battle was far from over. Days later, the police arrested Richard Calloway. His military background, once a shield that had protected him, now worked against him. The media quickly picked up on the story, shocked by the revelation of a respected retired officer's dark secrets. The case became high-profile, drawing attention not only for the horrific nature of the crime but for the way Zara had managed to outsmart her abuser and bring him to justice. Richard's trial was a spectacle. His defense attorneys tried to argue that the evidence against him was circumstantial, that Zara's testimony was unreliable, but nothing could change the facts. The recording was irrefutable. The truth was undeniable. Richard Calloway's crimes were exposed for the world to see. Zara took the stand, her heart pounding in her chest as she recounted the horrors she had witnessed, the abuse, the manipulation, the lies. She spoke of Mia's suffering, of the pain she had endured in silence, and of her own fear as she watched her sister's life slowly slip away. Zara's voice never wavered, even as she relived the worst moments of her life. She was no longer the frightened girl hiding in the shadows. She was a woman who had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. The trial was long, but in the end, the truth won out. The jury deliberated for hours, but there was no doubt in their minds. Richard Calloway was guilty of abuse, destruction of evidence, and ultimately causing Mia's death. His military reputation, once a symbol of honor, was now a tarnished memory, overshadowed by the atrocities he had committed in his own home. The judge delivered the verdict, life in prison. Richard's face remained emotionless, but Zara saw the flicker of something, fear, perhaps, behind his cold eyes. He had believed for so long that he was untouchable, that no one would ever expose him for the monster he was. But now, his world was collapsing around him. As the court adjourned, Zara felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. It wasn't the closure she had imagined, but it was something. She had taken down the man who had destroyed her sister's life, and she had done it with nothing but courage and determination. A few weeks later, Zara visited Mia's grave. The cold winds of winter blew through the cemetery, but Zara didn't feel the chill. She stood there in silence, her heart heavy with grief, but also filled with a sense of quiet pride. She had done it. She had made sure that Mia's suffering hadn't been in vain. She knelt down and placed a single white flower on the grave, her fingers trembling as she spoke softly to her sister. "I did it, Mia. I got him. I made sure he paid for what he did to you." Zara took a deep breath, allowing herself to cry for the first time in months. The tears weren't just for Mia, they were for everything she had lost, for the innocence that had been stolen from her, and for the strength she had found to survive. But there was something else, too. A sense of closure, of peace. She had honored Mia's memory by fighting for the truth. And now, with Richard locked away, she could begin to heal. As Zara stood up and turned to leave, she felt the weight of the past start to lift. There would be no more fear, no more hiding. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could breathe again. The nightmare was over. If you've enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more. Thank you for watching.